You can't fault the investigators. They go into it, and some of them believe that they are well prepared, but they're not.
Yeah.
Because they don't know any better. You know, I don't think that was right. I mean, that haunts me to this day.
Welcome to Internal Affairs, a police podcast. The IA guy here. Special guests, like always. Look, Bill Seki is going to stop by the studio. He definitely was a mentor of mine. I can tell you that a lot of my experience in internal affairs came from battling me prosecuting police officer, him defending cops. And we've done these border rights hearings, which you're going to hear a lot about. This whole process with the Los Angeles Police Department is what I refer to the big machine. So stand by for a really, really, really good episode. I'm really excited to have him on, and there's a lot of stories to be told, okay? So stay tuned. Before we begin the episode, we would like to express our sincere gratitude to our sponsor for supporting our YouTube channel. Savage Training Group. As one of several instructors, we provide high-quality training classes for law enforcement officers. We help them advance in their careers. But just remember, there is no death by PowerPoint, no check in the box. That's not the type of training that we do. If anything, the education doesn't stop. It continues onto your agency. Then we have the Titan Group. Their passionate investigators bring clarity to complexity and deliver results that withstand scrutiny with internal affairs investigations, workplace, and other complex types of investigations. We trust them to uncover the facts. In other words, no stone goes unturned. Last but not least, Code 7 Coffee. You know, as police officers first and aspiring coffee connoisseurs second, we appreciate their dedication to both professions. Their delicious coffee keeps us fueled during all of our podcast episodes. We are truly grateful to these sponsors for their generous contributions and support. Without them, our podcasts would not be possible. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Okay, we are back. The IA guy here with, you know, I always say it's a special guest, but this time around, it's actually someone who taught me a lot of this internal affairs stuff. Bill, thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
That's so awesome being here. I'm so proud of you, you know, for having this and giving people an opportunity to kind of find out what's going on.
Which, kind of before we get into this segment, I'll ask you the importance of internal affairs. Let me ask you this. So when you first saw the banner, or when you first something about this is Internal Affairs Police Podcast, what were your first thoughts?
I'm like, who the hell's doing this? And then I see it's you, and I'm like, that's a natural. And I'm watching. I'm like, you are just you're great. You're getting the conversation going, and people are willing to talk to you. Yeah. And you give a forum, and you make it in an environment which is easy for people to discuss it. I think that's the hardest part.
Yeah, and even though it's a bit taboo, I mean, come on, you've been doing this for decades, and you, as well as I know, that a topic like this, it's not that it's difficult to talk about. It's just that's something that people are not willing to talk about because they might feel as though they're being judged, and accountability. I think that's very, very important. And lucky me that I've gotten some guests that will hold the department accountable for the way they treat their their employees. And sometimes when you're accused, you get held accountable as well.
Well, you're giving people the opportunity to tell their story without it being edited by a journalist. And, you know, you see the twists and turns that get put on it because people have an agenda. And we're going to get to agendas. We're going to talk about agendas. But it's nice not to have that type of editing going on, you know, in terms of the content, in terms of what people say or how it's put out there.
Well, that's good. Well,
love it.
You know how important it is. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, rate the importance of internal affairs in a police department and why.
Okay, so in a perfect world, internal affairs is a 10 if it's used properly. And so I think there's a lot of conditions that go along with it because, you know, if you got bad cops, no one wants bad cops. No one wants criminals, you know, policing the streets. But internal affairs is no longer that. It's turned into something else. You're not dealing with crimes or real serious misconduct. It's like nickel and dime stuff that shouldn't be done by internal affairs.
Right.
And then you're wasting this time, these great resources. So yes, 10 if properly used, but now it's become a vehicle for people to forward their agendas.
Interesting. Do you also feel as though the responsibility of having such a negative stigma, where do you think that comes from? You think that comes from employees, leadership, or just us, or just culture? I mean, you've been around for decades, so I suppose what I'm asking is, we're always called what? The rat squad or the dark side, and we're so evil.
And so it's I think it's a combination of many things. So you have the misuse of internal affairs, because I think most people would agree. Every cop's going to agree. Yeah, I don't want to work with a dirty cop, right? But then when they see internal affairs coming in and picking on people for stuff that really is administrative, that's policy violations, things like that, that doesn't rise to that serious level, then they become jaded and they're like, why are you picking on me for something like that? And command staff kind of goes along with it.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to stop it. Somebody's got to say, well, why are we utilizing this valuable tool to do this? It makes sense.
You've been around long enough to know this big LAPD machine. That's what I like to call it. But you also have represented small agencies as well. So I'm curious to know, can you give us a little bit of a difference between the levels of review and the adjudication process of a big machine compared to a smaller agency that has, I suppose, a much more streamlined process? And what would be the difference?
Okay, so the big machine was created due to the size. You got to figure most small agencies are about the size of one LAPD division, or maybe even, smaller. They have maybe two professional responsibility or professional standards individuals. Okay. And you think about the number of complaints that come in. They get a lot of complaints for discourtesy, for this, for that, which are handled at a lower level. Maybe it's informal, talking to somebody.
Yeah.
And they keep on doing that until it really gets to the point where, maybe we need to document it. And you get a comment card or something like that. And then eventually you go through the process of maybe there's an internal affairs interview at some point, but it really takes quite a lot to get to that point.
Right.
And then you have a legal team that's usually involved. So the professional standard people do stuff. Yes, they have command staff telling them what to do, but when it comes down to adjudicating it and how things are written for the adjudication, you've got lawyers who are kind of looking at it saying, oh, well, I don't know that it meets this standard here, or I don't know that it necessarily violates that policy. Here, this machine is created where you don't have anyone reviewing the allegations that are being done. You've got police officers who are basically forming allegations of this is inappropriate. Well, what's inappropriate? By whose standard? There's no policy that's being listed in LAPD documents. They're not saying, oh, you violated this policy, or you violated this code section, or this city standard. Everything is very vague and very nebulous, and they like it that way, and it's unfair. Yeah. But that big machine, everyone has their little role, and they do things, but no one's checking them. They don't have lawyers looking at it. LAPD doesn't want lawyers involved. They don't want somebody saying, oh, I don't think this investigation was done very well. I think you need to do this. Oh, I don't think you have enough to support this allegation. They don't want to hear that because they know better. Yeah.
No, I've been there. I think you and I can agree since, you and I have done border rights hearings, and we'll get into that, where, a lot of the cases lack a lot of quality, and that has a lot to do with the responsibility of the IO. Let me ask you this. What is the one thing that you think all IA investigators should know? Like, if you were in a room full of just a whole bunch of new IA investigators, what would you tell them what their job is, or what would you like them to know?
They have to know how to conduct a thorough, unbiased, uninfluenced investigation. So I come back to the word agenda. You know, it's hard. As human beings, we always have an agenda. We see something and right off the bat, oh, this must have happened. And instead of investigating just to find the facts and see, okay, well, where do the facts lead us? Oftentimes, you have investigators who have come to a conclusion before anything's happened and start investigating to support their beliefs. That's not the way it's supposed to be done.
Right.
Right? And then you have investigators who aren't investigators. You know, they don't have the skills of a detective. They've never gone to detective school. They haven't done an extensive, detailed investigation. But we're calling on them to do these, but they don't have the skills.
Lack preparation.
They lack preparation.
Training.
They lack all the tools that they need to have to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's super important because I often ask, someone even asked me, hey, were you prepared to do this job in internal affairs? And I said, you know what? I was actually at officer rep section and I did a couple of complaints where we appealed because we felt that the allegations were not, they should have been unfounded. They were sustained. And we went through this whole process. So I got a good about a year and a half into some traction to do this. Unbeknownst to me, when I meet you and we're doing border rights, what an emotional roller coaster. And we'll talk a little bit about mental wellness a little bit later on. But, you know, I totally agree with you. But let's get into, because this is going to be a great trip down memory lane, because I'm going to ask you at each stop. So here we go. 1988 to 1997, you were a deputy district attorney, right?
Yep.
You were DDA, and you prosecuted public officials, cops. What was that like?
I did. For about 3.5 years, I was in their what was called Special Investigation Division. Okay. Not some place that people volunteered to go to, but I had a supervisor who was going there, and he wanted to bring me along with him, you know, and I was flattered. So I went, kind of knowing what they did, but not really. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you don't want to be anti-law enforcement when you're a DDA, right? I mean, here you are, you're working with them hand in glove, putting on cases, helping them with investigations, things like that. But it was an opportunity to kind of see what was going on and ensure that people who had agendas weren't in that spot. Okay, again, the word agendas.
Yes.
Because there were people who were totally anti-law enforcement who were in that unit, who had things happen to their family, they grew up in the wrong place, whose parents had been beaten, who were former defense attorneys, who didn't like cops. I mean, they were there doing these cases, and I'm thinking, can you be fair? And I always considered myself fair, and I'm looking at these investigations, and there were times where, you know, things were troubling, right? Okay, well, what do I do about it? Have my investigator, let's go look, let's go figure this out. And then there are other cases where I'm like, it's totally justified. And you learn the standards, right? You learn, okay, here, I got to put in front of a jury, right? It's not like I'm dealing with a gang member. I'm dealing with somebody who has good character witnesses. And remember, I wasn't just doing police officers. I was doing judges. I was doing politicians. I was doing, you know, people who were of note. So I'm always thinking, I got to make sure I have a case that's better than just a regular 211 or a burglary case or whatever else. Uh-huh. And so I want to make sure that I've got all my ducks lined up. There were there were a few in the unit who, no, they weren't like that because they had their agenda. And I thought, hey, you know what? If I'm law enforcement, I would tell my law enforcement friends, who would you rather have there, me or somebody who wants to be there? Because I didn't want to be there. But I'm going to look at these cases fairly. Mm-hmm. And I did. And there were times where I had to file charges against law enforcement. Didn't like it, wasn't happy about it, but it was necessary. And there are other cases where somebody would say, oh, you should probably file. I'm looking at it, I'm like, I can't prove this. Graham versus Connor. I can't look at it in 20/20 hindsight. I've got to look at the time that this shooting occurred and see what it was that the officer saw. To stand in their shoes as a reasonable officer would and kind of figure out, okay, does this make sense or not? So,
yeah, it's you keep using the word agenda, which I refer to self-serving. It's practically one and the same, right? So we can agree that, and that's the shitty part about all this. It's at some point it becomes personal.
Yeah.
And that never sat well with me both ways when I defended cops on just some minor misconduct, or when I was working as an advocate, which, by the way, I was told when I got to the advocate section, hey, Marlon, don't think of this as a prosecutorial role. You know what? I call bullshit. It is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if you're doing what you're supposed to, and you look at the manual that says, oh, you're supposed to put everything out there, good and bad. Well, that wasn't happening. You're not putting out the bad for your case. You're only putting out the stuff that shows that you can prove your case.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, no, totally. You taught me a lot. That's for sure.
No, you taught me a lot. You made me up my game. You started doing like PowerPoint presentations and stuff. I'm like, oh my God, I got to do a PowerPoint. This isn't even a criminal case, and I've got to do a PowerPoint for this. I'm spending hours putting this thing together, and I can barely do it, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I'm a PowerPoint. I love the slides, man. It's the visual. You got to see what's going on. January of 1998, you went to the big leagues, man. Let's see, Munger, Gonda, and Seki.
Right.
Rampart Scandal.
So
let's talk about that. First of all, when did that start? It says 1998. So that was right after the Rampart Scandal, or tell me what's going on.
No, so 98. So Daryl Munger, the legend, right?
The legend.
Daryl had been defending police officers, and again, I was in JSID, and we would have cases together. And at some point, he said, "I'm tired of dealing with you. Come with me." Mm-hmm. All right. So we joined forces along with Jody Gonda. And it was after that period of time when Rampart kind of evolved, right? And we hear, okay, there's stuff going on with Rampart Crash. Next thing you know, we're assigned one of the main players, right? We had many of the different officers, but we get assigned the main player. And so I'm defending him criminally. And, we're going through interviews, this and that. It's one of these things where who knew how big it was going to be? Because it shouldn't have been as big as it was made out to be. Yeah. But it was. Here's a quick story. So here we are. My client is going to come to my office because we're going to surrender, because we learned that charges are going to be filed. And here we are. We work it out with the courts, the judges of the Superior Court, Criminal Courts building downtown. We talked to different people. I was, okay, great. We're going to bring him in. All right, fantastic. Walk him in. Walk him through the front door. Who knows? He may not come out with us, but we walk him in. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows we're doing that. He's driving to my office, and there's a felony takedown of him. Why? Because the chief of police didn't like the way we're doing it, and he didn't agree. So he decided to do a felony takedown. And so I'm like, what the hell? Where's my client? So the next time I see him, he's behind bars, right? And I'm like, that's not supposed to happen. But again, grandstanding, agenda, right? He wanted the news to catch it, that he had done this. And yet, we had already come to an agreement with everybody else in the criminal justice system about how this was going to be done. But that chief said, no, we're going to do it my way. So, in the end, we spend, years going through this, right? Years. And, I sit with my guy. Obviously, his partner was, one of the main guys, and it was the two of them. And his partner had basically laid everybody out. But we learned that the way that the interviews were conducted with him were bullshit, right?
Right.
They weren't done right. And so then, in the end, we end up sitting days with the DA's office and the U.S. attorneys and going through all of the allegations that Rafael Perez had made, and basically debunk them, and prove that, no, it wasn't this grand conspiracy by all these guys. It was really two guys who were doing things.
And that is super important because, for all the young officers and, the audience that we have that really just heard this Rampart scandal, I couldn't agree with you more. I think the media made it out to be this huge scandal. Oh, my God, if Rampart's doing it, I think all the crash units in LAPD is doing it, and what it really turned out to be was just these two individuals.
Right. There may have been administrative things, okay? But it happens all over. Happens with all specialized units because you have them working, and they're working toward a goal. But when it comes to people who were doing crimes wasn't there. And from that, it changed the course of LAPD, right? Because now you have the consent decree coming in. You have all these eyes looking. And ever since then, LAPD's changed. Everything's under a microscope. LAPD, everything you do is under a microscope. All these other agencies are still operating differently now, but kind of, they don't have that same eye on them. So they can do the policing the way they used to. Things may have changed because of the climate, but LAPD's gotten to the point where every move that's made is second guessed again.
Couldn't agree with you more. 1997, when Chief Parks became the chief of police, Special Order Number 1 was the 181. Everything you shall take. It doesn't matter what that allegation is. Someone walks in the front desk or someone calls and says what you believe to be alleged misconduct. You got to memorialize it. And then after that, in 2001, I'm sure you can agree, this is the consent decree hit, and now 181 became the 128, and that's our culture, and that's what we call it. Bill, let me ask you this though, because at that time that you arrived, you were at scene in January of 1998. Can you kind of give us how did this border rights process begin? Because I do know that at one point it was in-house, right? So it was like your peers representing your own. And then at 2001, slowly but surely, we decided to get into lawyers who are really experienced in doing this.
So you had a choice at that point in time to have representation from another police officer or a lawyer. I think the union kind of changed in terms of how they were looking at things. And when Rampart came around, it's like, well, we've got to have lawyers representing all of these people. No disrespect to you all who represented them, but it was serious.
Yeah.
You needed good representation. And up to that point in time, it'd be pick and choose. Boards at that point in time were done at the Bradbury building, right? You had 2 command staff, you had 1 civilian. We'd put the boards on, and people worked hard. Then there was probably, the influence of the chief at that time that was on some of the people. But you had independent thinkers, too, who were on command staff. So independent thinkers would basically go against the chief in their findings, and the next thing you know, they're sitting in the chief's office. What the hell are you doing? You don't want to be promoted, right? Oh, I'm going to assign you over here. I'm going to put you somewhere else, right? So the influence of the department really came down on the process at that point in time. And then in terms of internal affairs was interviewing people at that time. And again, it was put out that everyone's bad. And so investigators were interviewing people with that notion, very adversarial. We would fight, we would argue. And slowly but surely, investigators who were true believers came around to realize, it's not what the chief put it out to be. And it changed the complexion of how investigations were done. They weren't as adversarial, as we went along. People would hide stuff. They wouldn't let you see things. They wouldn't tell you what it was about. Everything was an argument. If you made an objection, oh, no, you don't get to. We're ordering him to talk. No, I'm his lawyer. I'm telling him not to talk. We'd go back and forth. And some of the staunchest investigators in that case ended up changing their minds. And actually, some of them ended up going to ORS, Officer Rep Section, representing officers. And then you see the development down the road. We get another chief. And when Bratton came in, things kind of changed for the better. The process was fairer in many respects. There was no more of this, what they called gotcha, right? Catching people for false and misleading, saying, oh, I got you lying, or this or that, hiding the ball. Things were much more on the table when you went through an interview. And in terms of investigations and the relationship between investigators and lawyers, it was much, much better. And in terms of people being ordered to boards, they were ordered to boards for very serious things. And a lot of the penny-ante stuff, no, we can deal with that with discipline of, written reprimand, training, stuff like that. But it wasn't, you're going to be fired. And then we had another swing, right?
Yeah.
And we're here where we are today.
Yeah, you know what? I kind of want to focus a little bit on these boards, these hearings, because I know when we met, and I got there in 2011, I always felt like, okay, he's an attorney and very experienced. He's been around, he's done a lot of this, and I'm just a sergeant of police, and the board members are command staff officers. They probably don't have any legal background. Kind of give me your opinion as to, and by the way, I mean, for crying out loud, you run the trial advocacy team in Southwestern Law School. So it's almost as if, and I've been meaning to ask you, did you feel like, you know, I'm a D1 All-American and I'm sitting here with, you know, somewhat of a circuit. But, you know, as humorous as it may sound, my thinking is that I take it from your lens, you just wanted this to be fair, but not so technical in terms of legal objections and all that. What's your thoughts on that?
So you have to understand, right? I mean, because I have done administrative hearings for agencies other than LAPD. Okay. And when you do it in front of other agencies, you don't have command staff sitting there. You have lawyers sitting there. I mean, you may do it in front of civil service commissions, and again, you may have civilians, some who are lawyers, some who aren't, but you don't have command staff there, right? LAPD, I don't know any other agency in this country where command staff sits to decide discipline in the same way, where they're the adjudicator, the final adjudicator, right? So going back to that, it was different for me because I'm used to rules. I had been a trial lawyer, you know, for all this time, trying cases, jury trials, having judges tell me you can't do things, having somebody call balls and strikes, right? And now I'm going into this thing. And in some ways, it was a free-for-all because stuff would come in. Oh, well, I want to hear what it is. These command staff, right, they're not lawyers. Right. But it's like, well, no, I'm going to let this in. I want to hear.
And give it its proper weight.
Right.
Isn't the famous
right.
line?
But, you know, it's like, really? It has nothing to do with this. On the flip side, stuff that I would normally introduce if it was a criminal trial, like character evidence to show that, oh, yeah, this is BS because this person's character is not like that. They're like, well, you can't introduce character evidence. What do you mean I can't introduce? You're trying to introduce pattern evidence to show that in a prior occasion, this person may have done something. And so that's character evidence, isn't it? That this person has a propensity, and yet I can't show the reverse. How fair is that?
Yeah.
Right? So one of the things in doing this, you had to learn who your audience is, right? Just like in any case.
Yeah.
And when it came to command staff, you know, well, they're not lawyers. Some of them may have been more pro-chief, and you know, they want to basically appease the chief because they didn't want to get called in. But you also had the ones who are the free thinkers.
There's an agenda.
There's an agenda, exactly. So you had to pick the right ones, right? In the process, you got 4 names. You had to pick 2 of the 4 to sit, and then you had a civilian. You got 3 names. You pick 1, and that's your board. In the end, I learned to love it, especially when Bratton was in office, and the first part of Beck's regime, because I thought, I can do this. I can work it. And I was successful. I had good luck. So I didn't really want it to change to an all-civilian board. I was one of the few who was like opposed to that. Because why change something when it's working for me, right?
Right.
At the same time, I understood that all civilians was kind of in line with what all the other agencies throughout the U.S. were doing.
Right.
So why is LAPD different? We should do the same thing.
Right.
And then you see who's there. And they're lawyers. There's some who aren't, but you have people who are smart.
Yes.
They're not idiots.
Right.
And you know, the misconception is, oh, well, they're too lenient. No. You have people who are employment lawyers. You have people who have been in law enforcement. You have people who are judges, administrative judges, who sit there, who understand the law.
Yeah.
You know, and they're cloaked now as being stupid.
Right.
You know, they're pushovers. No, they're not. They're not. They're intelligent, smart people who are able to see what a case is worth, who are able to see that an investigation is done poorly or maybe done well, They're able to see people who, who don't deserve to be police officers versus others who, wow, look at all they've done and they made a misstep here. Should we fire them for this one misstep? So I think you get more fairness now than you did before. And they're not beholden to anybody. They don't necessarily have that agenda.
I was, about the only thing, me too, I was also opposed to all civilian board, only because I just felt like some maybe have an agenda, take something personal. What I, from my lens, what I didn't know is if I'm putting on a case for a DUI and you just happen to have a family member who was involved in the DUI and, you know, maybe got killed in that DUI,
Right.
I may think that you're just probably checked out. You know, doesn't matter what you're introducing or what witness you're bringing in. That could be that bias for any type of, or you probably have a family member that perhaps wasn't treated well by the police. That was always in back of my mind. But the flip side of that is, and what I was going to ask you is, I suppose in a nice way, we can say that there's probably a lot of command staff officers that lack competence.
It's different today with command staff. There are a lot of command staff officers I don't know. Maybe that's my fault. But, back in the day, I would know them from the time they were officers till they became sergeants and lieutenants. And I'd see them on patrol. I'd see them, supervising officers. I knew that they would go to different detective assignments or special assignments, things like that. But they put their years in, right?
Yeah.
It took a long time to become a captain before.
Yeah.
Right? You'd have to put like your 20 plus years on.
Correct.
It doesn't happen the same way anymore.
No.
And, not to diminish the intelligence of these people, but I think a lot of them don't have that same street smarts. They grew up in a different culture. A lot of them inside, a lot of them not having that same street way about them, understanding what a patrol officer deals with, or understanding what a gang enforcement officer deals with, or understanding what it is to be an undercover officer. They lack that, and I think the climate today, unfortunately, is there was a lot of do as I say or else coming from the top, which didn't sit well. Do you remember back in the day when somebody was found guilty? And so for those not familiar with the process with LAPD, there's a guilt phase to determine whether the evidence is there. And then after that is the penalty phase.
Correct.
And you get to call character witnesses, right? They go through the personnel package. You see the commendations. You see ratings.
Witnesses.
You see all the good stuff. And you see the bad stuff if they've had priors. But the witnesses were character witnesses. And it was valuable under command staff to have command character witnesses, right? People who would come and say, yeah, you know what? Marlon's worked for me. Love the guy. Works hard. I know he made this misstep, but I would take him back. Yep. I'd have him work for me. I was sitting in the waiting room, waiting. I was on a break with my Board of Rights, and there was a captain sitting there. And that captain said to me, I don't know if I should be here. And this is within the past 5 years. I'm like, why? The chief told us if we want to promote, don't testify. Don't testify.
Yeah.
And so now you rarely have captains come in to testify as character witnesses, not like it was before. Before, they would definitely do it for their troops. Now they come in when you've got somebody who was their classmate, who's been around for 30 years or whatever else. It's not the way it was before.
Totally. And one of several reasons why I decided to do this podcast is, you hit the spot on with that. And if we're going to be transparent, I too, as an advocate, as a prosecuting, representing the chief of police, have those opinions where we get to the penalty phase, and here we are with character witnesses. I sometimes gotten phone calls from classmates or colleagues who'll tell me, hey, Marlon, you think I should go? And I would always say, look, definitely confer with the attorney you're their character witness. However, you just know that you're putting your reputation on the line. But you know what? If you had that integrity and you really cared about that individual, then go for it.
Right.
You know, and so oftentimes I'll always tell, and this is the honest truth. Look, you can be a captain at a division, and you can adjudicate to your client, you know what, this is going to be sustained, and I'm just going to give you an official reprimand, what we call paper penalty. It goes up what I call the 6 cents or the cookie jar, which I think, you know, not many people are familiar, but in LAPD, you have the captain 1 and the captain 3 in the division. You have the deputy chief and the commander at bureau. You have a deputy chief and the commander at internal affairs. And guess what? Someone's got to go to the 10th floor and present it and sell it. So what ends up, and you and I can agree, there's rare concurrence at all levels. And so the captain recommends an OR, and they might end up with a 10, 15 day or a board.
Or the Board of Rights. I've
At a
seen
Board
that.
of Rights.
I've seen in the past few years, an OR to a Board of Rights. How does that happen?
More so is, you know what? I'm going to come in and be your character witness. And I'm going to let them know what my recommendation was. And here's the deal. And this is reality. Look, if you're a young sergeant or a young lieutenant that's going to end up being a command staff officer in LAPD, welcome to the show. This is exactly what's going to happen. So my thing is that if it's going to cost you a promotion or a bitchin' job, you know what? So be it. But what you should do is hold your integrity and tell the board, you know what? Yes, I recommended an R, and here are the reasons why. And we've gotten away from that, and I'm a little surprised because you're telling me it happened in the last 5 years. I was taking you back to 2011 and 2015 when I was there. We were doing boards together, but I also wanted to mention is, wasn't it kind of strange to know that you have these board members as command staff officers that work for the chief, but they have to make an independent decision, and yet, well, wait a minute, I kind of work for the chief, and the chief not only directed them to go to this hearing, but he wants them terminated.
Yeah. No, I have so many stories of times when different chiefs, in particular the one that preceded our chief from back east and the one after, where people got ordered to boards. And as I said, we have independent thinkers or people who are willing to keep their minds open, and they look at the evidence and are like, well, this is not a termination case. And so they decide to keep the person. And then I find out from them later or hear through the grapevine, they got dressed down. They got dressed down. They got yelled at. I mean, people heard them being yelled at, or they get transferred.
Yeah.
Right? Or they're up for a promotion, to commander or something else. It doesn't happen. Why? Because they did the right thing.
Yep. And that's what it's about. It's about integrity.
Right.
I totally 100% agree with you on that. You've done, not even in the hundreds, I take it we're at the thousands. The question I have for you is, and now that we're already kind of flushed out and talked about the Board of Rights hearing process, let me ask you this in terms of quality of cases. In other words, give me a percentage, man. Look, how many of those actually belonged? Because, by the way, it's supposed to be serious misconduct, right? Look, the best bang for your buck is what? A false statement, misleading, maybe perjury, or an cubo, like something off-duty that just was so bad that reflected so negative on the eyes of the department, yourself, the community.
Right.
That ends up at a board. So for people who are watching and listening is, what's the percentage like in terms of cases? Because I know you're in the thousands.
When I look at, let me give you a for instance. So 1 year, I probably did 20 boards. Okay. And for those of you who don't know, a board is kind of like a mini trial. They take maybe 4 to 5 days to put on, some maybe less. But I probably had 20 boards. Of that 20, I want to say 15 were for termination. Okay? Of that 15, 3 were terminated. Okay. I pride myself in being a good lawyer, but I'm not that good. if you put a case out there that deserves termination, and again, this was during a command staff era. This was not during a civilian board era. This was during a command staff board era. 12 of those termination cases were either found not guilty or the penalty was reduced. How is that? Why does that happen? You know what? When it comes out during the board, what the case is about, what the witnesses testify to isn't what's in the complaint investigation. Why? Because as human beings, we hear certain things and then we put it down and interpret what we want to put down. And then somebody then takes that and then they give a briefing to the chief or whomever, and they get a limited amount of information and they're making that decision. And they think they're right. But the command staff or the civilians or whoever else is listening to it, they got to question these people too. They got to see what their credibility is. They got to determine whether or not I'm going to believe this person or not. That you don't get on paper, right?
Yeah.
When you hear the live testimony, it's like, oh, that story doesn't make sense. Or, I really believe this officer. I really believe, because they're convincing, right? And people have BS meters. You know, like I said, there are a lot who are judges. And again, this was, or lawyers rather, this was a time when command staff boards were happening. So the command staff is looking at these witnesses and determining their credibility. Or they're seeing that these investigations, they didn't ask the right questions, or they didn't even interview these witnesses, or they didn't get this evidence, or they didn't do this or that the investigations were so lacking that the evidence they had really didn't support the allegations were there. And then we come back to what I mentioned a lot earlier, is that no one's reviewing the allegations to determine whether or not the evidence supports it, or whether or not that's even an appropriate allegation.
Right.
LAPD doesn't have that check. Other agencies do.
Yeah.
LAPD doesn't.
Yeah.
So.
And there's an agenda.
Yeah, and there's an agenda. But, you know, so when you ask me, well, what's the percentage? I just think so many of them are just poorly done.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree. I mean, I think 30 in my 4 or 5 years there, and I say this all the time, I've had 30 plus hearings that I put on. I probably prepared for about 40 of them. And out of the 35 of them were termination cases facing a false statement. And you know what? They were legitimate, and it happened. Great. But the question is, what happens to those other 25? And that's where my mantra, no stone goes unturned. It's just poor quality.
Right.
And that's what I was trying to get to, where, you know what, goes back to what we were talking earlier. Look, if you're going to do this type of function, you should be prepared, not only just with, knowledge and skill, experience, but also emotionally too, and
you can't fault the investigators. They go into it, and some of them believe that they are well prepared, but they're not.
Yeah.
Because they don't know any better, right?
Right.
They feel like they're doing a good job. But if you think about, you get somebody who's experienced in investigations, they're going to ask, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do this?
Right.
Or if you have someone looking at it who's going to put it on, they would say, well, how come you didn't interview this witness or do this, right?
Yeah.
Somebody has eyes who's actually knows what they're doing, as opposed to people who never put on a case. You got people who've never put on a case who are determining whether or not there's enough evidence to adjudicate this.
Yeah, no, totally. Before we get off this really important topic, today we are faced, LAPD, with getting rid of this border rights hearing process and perhaps making it like civil service, right? You can kind of fill me in and educate me. There might be a possibility in the future where if you're facing serious allegations of misconduct, you might walk into the chief's office and they're going to tell you you're terminated, and then you're going to have to go through, I would imagine they're trying to negotiate binding arbitration. What's your thoughts on that, if any?
It's going to be a shock to the LAPD community, because that's what happens to every other agency. You get fired and you fight for your job. Okay, here, you're not technically fired. You're relieved.
Correct.
You're not paid, right? You don't get benefits, but they didn't say they fired you yet.
Correct.
Which is kind of silly.
Right.
De facto, they did. Binding arbitration? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting. I think there's a lot of pros and cons to it.
Yeah.
I have, like I said, for as much as I disdain this system, there's a lot of great things about it
Yeah,
for officers.
let's make that clear.
For
Absolutely.
officers, absolutely. LAPD officers have it better than most. They have more rights than most. But at the same time, do I see a change happening immediately? I don't know about immediately.
Right.
I just can't see it.
Right.
It's been in place for so long. It's a huge shift. It's a huge shift. And I don't know that the department and the city are ready for that. You hear the lip service. Oh, yeah, let's do this. Let's do this. Everyone's, oh, yeah, let's do this. But really, is that what you want to do? Think about it. Think about the ramifications for that.
Well, speaking of pros and cons, and I'm just being a little silly here with cons, is you've now border rights. There's no advocates sergeants are kind of going away, and now there's city attorneys, right? So you tell me, now there's a room of 5 attorneys.
Sometimes.
Well, let's say the board members,
Right,
for lack of better words,
Right.
they're all attorneys.
Right.
You and now the Department serves with attorney.
But that's
talk
more,
about a technical warfare.
But that's more akin to what happens in other agencies,
True.
right? When I do it with another agency, I'm putting on a hearing. I'm an attorney. They're represented. The department's represented by an attorney. And you have a mediator
who used to be an attorney or a judge.
Who is an attorney,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, and you're dealing with all kinds of issues, legal issues, whatever else. But I mean, I think the playing field is better for everybody.
Okay. It serves
right?
its purpose.
And we all speak the same language, right?
Yeah.
And there has to be education there because sometimes you have law enforcement issues, policies, right? Or tactics, things that a mediator may not be familiar with.
Correct.
Okay, well, they've got to be educated, right? And that was my worry in going to civilian boards is we're going to spend so much time educating people. But
that hasn't been the case.
That hasn't been the case. I think one of the things that I would love to see with hearing officers, and this goes across the board for anyone doing law enforcement stuff, is that they need training. They have to see what you see.
Yeah.
They've got to go out in the field. They got to get their hands dirty. They've got to sit in a patrol car. They've got to go through a station. They have to understand it.
A search warrant.
Right. I mean, if you're going to use the standard of Graham versus Connor, that you have to place somebody instead of 20/20 hindsight as a reasonable officer in the same position. Well, how do you know what that is?
Yeah.
Unless you've experienced it or at least have an idea of what it may be. If you've never been in a patrol car or never been party to seeing somebody arrested or never been in a station, how difficult is it for you to understand what an officer goes through on a daily basis? You can't. You can't put yourself in their shoes. You can't put yourself to say, oh, yeah, this is what a reasonable officer would do. You have talking heads on both sides, experts who, again, have agendas, right, who are going to give you different views. Okay, which one's right?
I don't know. We're about to find out, right?
Right.
Yeah, totally. Before I wrap it up, I really want to know, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but are we the only agency, my beloved LAPD, that actually has a definition of a false and a definition of misleading statement? My question to you is, how was that utilized in terms of the standard of proof? What do you think? You think it's just 51%? Or should it be... You know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, no, I know where you're going with it.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're accusing somebody of that, what is something false? Does that mean it's not true? What if somebody has a belief that what they say actually occurred, and maybe they're not right? Is that false? Right?
Yeah.
So there's no allowance for that in the way that LAPD looks at things. There really isn't. And you're going to screw somebody's life, their career. You're going to take away their home.
They're going to lose it all.
Divorces. All this stuff has happened as a result of people losing their jobs because of that definition of false and or misleading statement, which is not accurately defined.
Totally. I'm a true believer. You know what? You need to crank that up.
Yeah.
It's not 51.
No.
It's not more likely than not.
No. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You've got to prove intent. You've got to prove the knowledge and intent. And that's not necessarily part of it.
Right.
Or if it is, it's not clear. Or if it is, people are willing to ignore that,
Yeah.
right? There's so many just issues with that false and misleading.
Totally. I'm with you 100%. Help me with this as it relates to mental wellness.
Mm-hmm.
You have done this for decades. Has mental wellness as it relates to discipline in the forefront now than it was back 20 years ago? And what is it that we can do better to ensure that, you know what, we're there for them? You know, look, it's that saying that one of my guests said it best, Jimmy Zurich, who's a director, said it
Great
best.
guy, yeah.
You know, Jimmy Z is awesome. He said, look, Marlon, you know what? The punishment is not the penalty. The punishment is the process.
Mm-hmm. So think about this. What do we do to care for people? There's the ugly 4 letters, PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
People don't realize, and again, I'm not a psychologist. This is just my own opinion.
Yeah.
But a majority of officers probably suffer through some sort of PTSD. Because how can you go out every day in the streets of LA and people hate you? Or they spew hate towards you. They call you names, but you can't say anything. You can't do anything. Because if you did, that's misconduct, right?
Correct.
Somebody's using the F word against you. They're doing all kinds of stuff, and you just have to take it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you respond back in kind, you're going to get a 128.
Yes.
You're going to have an internal affairs investigation. So you got to bottle that all up, right? They say we, meaning LAPD, we provide resources. But do we really?
Yeah.
Because if you say, I'm suffering from this, how many will say, well, you're weak? Or if you use the 4-letter word PTSD, it's like, oh, well, are you fit?
Yeah. We start attacking them.
We start attacking them. And then you have this
And passing
process
judgment.
that Jimmy Zurich talked about. You know, people get sent home. People get sent home. They're good officers. One day you're working the streets, you're doing everything, and the next thing you know, you're sent home. I had an officer, we talked about it before we started, who was part of this alleged scandal, who well-respected, former military, former Marine, people loved him, worked hard, and he gets sent home for 4 years and a day.
Oh, man.
Right? He's being paid, but 4 years and a day. For a couple of those years, he didn't know what it was. Nobody would tell him. He'd call me, why am I home? I'm saying, I don't know. Nobody's telling us because there are mass complaints, right?
Yeah.
Eventually we find out, but the fact that the department says, well, you're being paid, we can send you home, we can assign you there. And somebody's like, well, this is not why I came here. What kind of mental wellness is that? What are we telling that person? And no one's checking on them to see how they're doing.
Totally. No,
right.
That's always bothered me. And you know what? In addition to that is, if he's exonerated,
right,
he's supposed to come back to work and say, you know what? Everything is going to be
exactly.
okay.
Exactly.
And how does that impact morale?
Exactly. How do you not turn people against you when you treat them that way? Mm-hmm. You know, unless you have good friends who are calling you on a regular basis saying, oh, how you doing? What are you doing? No one from the department is going out there and saying, hey, man, we just want to let you know, we want to check on you.
Yeah.
We're worried about you. Want to make sure you're doing okay. Hey, here's some resources. Go. They may do that once, but nobody's doing follow-up.
Yeah, and for the record, it's
hard.
That's a more of anything, maybe a commanding officer's job to do that. And let's not say that they're all like that. I mean, there's over 80 plus command staff officers. What we're saying is that it's
as an institution, it's not done right.
We can do way more than what we have today. And that's what bothers me. That's the message that we're trying to send, and I really appreciate that. Man, we can really get into all this.
Oh, yeah.
Worst and best. Let's do that now in this segment.
Worst and best.
Give me worst case that you dealt with, that you were involved in, that, one that you can pick, or just something that, in your career as a police administrative lawyer, you dealt with, that you can think of that just pops in your mind.
Worse. When you say worse, then I turn to like the criminal cases, obviously Rampart in terms of that.
Yeah.
I had an officer I defended in another city years and years ago who was charged with murder, dealing with somebody who was 5150 and basically ended up holding their head down to the gurney, and they said that due to that the person died. And I don't think that was right. I mean, that haunts me to this day.
Wow.
So worse, yeah, I mean, I've seen guys do crazy stuff. I mean, I can go on
And on.
days and days. I can write, books on on the things that I've seen and heard.
Yeah.
The saddest stuff is guys who are facing things which they think is very serious, which they don't want anyone to know about, and end up ending their lives.
Yeah.
Right, for no reason. And I hear, I mean, I can't understand that. I know people get into dark areas, but when that happens, it's shocking.
Yeah.
And I've had too many clients over the years, to have more than one is too many.
Correct.
But, I've had about 4 or 5 clients over the years who, I'm telling them, yeah, we can get through this. And then I get a phone call.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's the worst part of doing this.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
I my sentiment to that is just, again, we can do so much better.
Yeah.
To avoid all
Yeah.
that, because you're right. One is even enough.
The best?
Yes, give me good. Let's do on
Wow.
a good note.
So there's
So rewarding.
So there's good. I've got a couple of goods. One good is somebody who actually lost their job. Lost their job, ended up becoming a lawyer, ended up just doing it incredibly well, and is in a better position than they ever would have been in had they stayed with the department. Wrongfully accused, part of the Rampart stuff, but had the wherewithal to pick themselves up, get a law degree, become a partner in a firm, and is just tremendous, a tremendous individual, just
That's
doing
awesome.
so well. Other best, a couple of guys who have survived recently got promoted to sergeant after 4 years, like the guy I was telling you about. He was sitting
Wow.
at home for 4 years and a day and recently got promoted. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it is fantastic.
I mean, it's late in coming, but, 2 of them had gone through this. One had been prosecuted criminally, had the case dismissed, went through a board of rights, exonerated, had to go through a system called the Board of Inquiry, which had not been used since Parks, but I've done 4 of them now, to see if they're fit to be promoted to a supervisor. And fortunately, under our interim chief, have been promoted. And it's amazing because they're not bitter.
yeah.
So to go through what they went through and not be bitter, and they want to help. They want to learn. They want to, help others advance and to understand what it is to go through what they've been through.
Adversity.
Right, the adversity. And to make other officers understand and to be better. They still believe. They believe in the department. They
Yes.
believe why they're here.
Yes, someone like that would definitely have loved to have on the show. Hopefully, we were talking about this before we started. I really hope the culture, and as we keep doing more of these episodes, where it's okay for you to come in to talk about what happened to you without thinking the department, is coming after you for
Right.
what? For a story that a lot of people can just learn from.
Right. No, it's people have to get over it.
Yeah,
And there's a lot to learn, a lot to be shared that's positive
positive.
as opposed to being negative.
Absolutely.
And I think, you offer them a safe space, as you said, and an opportunity to tell their story and others to learn from it in a positive way.
Which will close it. We're at the end here, and I leave the floor up to you to give any advice to whoever is watching. I know the majority of the audience is obviously law enforcement, but you never know. There might be a young officer who's trying to come on the job. Trying to promote an applicant that's trying to come on the job, or anyone who's trying to make command staff. Whatever position they are in their journey in law enforcement. What advice would you give?
I started this 26 years ago as defending police officers. I've been a lawyer for 36 years. we've seen a lot of changes in the past 4 years in terms of the criminal justice system, in terms of law enforcement. And there's good that's come out of it. Policing is done differently. I think you have to be aware of who it is that you are representing. You have to be aware of your constituency. You have to understand them. You guys, to be a police officer is the hardest job. When I was young, I used to run around the streets. I had my run-ins with police officers, and I wanted to be a public defender because I thought, as a person of color, that's what I needed. I mean, I had parents who were incarcerated in World War II because they were Japanese American, right? That was my understanding.
That was your calling.
That was my calling. So here I am, wanting to be a public defender. I become a DA. But what I learned from that is, when you are put in a position to help others, you've got to take advantage of that, right? And there is a lot of misunderstanding that goes on. I'm going to go back to what I started to say about you all. You're misunderstood. People think, oh my God, they just uphold the law. No. They just arrest people. No. You all go to calls. You have to be police officers. You've got to enforce the law. You have to be social workers, because you're dealing with people who sometimes have mental issues.
Yes.
You have to be psychologists, because you've got to deal with parties who aren't getting along and talk to them and kind of settle things. Can you imagine? I mean, here it is. Sometimes you guys are marriage counselors, because you arrive at a scene where a couple has been married for 50 years and they get into an argument and somebody does something stupid. Well, does that mean that they should be arrested? You guys have to understand, you have to educate people.
Yes.
So you're teaching them. You have to be all of these things. And yet, when people come on the job, especially less now than it used to be, but come on straight out of high school or out of the military, you don't have those life skills.
Yeah.
Right? To be a police officer requires an incredible set of skills. You've got to be a great listener. You have to be a great communicator now. You have to be understanding. You have to have empathy. You just can't look at everyone and say, this is the way I'm going to handle it, because everyone's different.
Yeah.
Every situation's different.
Totally.
And law enforcement needs to change. They've tried to, but they don't understand what they need to do. And that's the sad part. We'll eventually get there.
Yeah, we will.
We'll get there. We're in this bumpy part. We've got this pendulum swinging back and forth, so hopefully it's going to swing back to a way where, people who commit crimes aren't going to get away with it, right? And we're not just going to, throw people in jail because for their socioeconomic reasons they were born into the wrong time or wrong era, right? We can't do that. We got to help them. I mean, mental health is a huge issue, and I think we've come a long way, but we have to kind of understand it better to really have law enforcement be part of it, because you guys deal with it every day.
Yeah, totally.
Every day. So the advice is, make sure that you're prepared to come on. Be well versed in all of these aspects before you come on. Be willing to learn. Be open-minded. Be willing to take criticism. And be willing to learn from great people. Have good mentors.
Speaking of, you were definitely a great mentor to me. Speaking about willing to learn, I can't even begin to thank you for teaching me a lot when we battled. It meant a lot to me.
They were battles. They were tough.
They were tough, and they were fun. And you made it so comfortable for me. Sometimes I was a nervous wreck, and you just you were a bright light in such a dark situation. And I got to be honest with you, out of all the jobs in my 24-year career, that particular assignment was difficult emotionally. And you made it great, and you are a friend forever. And I thank you so much for being part of all this.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me participate.
Don't stop to think that a lot has to do with what happened in these boards and the people that I've met, and and I consider you not only a friend but a great mentor. And I thank you so much for all of it.
No, thank you. Thank you for doing what you're doing, for having a forum, for giving us an opportunity to kind of let people know what really goes on, to kind of get inside how the sausage is made. You are a great friend, you know, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to express myself.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. We're going to wrap it up like always. Please be safe out there. And you know what? Don't forget to go Code 6. Thank you.